2020 has so far been a remarkably eventful and turbulent year, with the spotlight centred on the United States due to their political response to the coronavirus pandemic and the Black Lives Matter movement. This has led to one of the world's most important election campaigns in recent history, with significant implications for quenching the coronavirus pandemic, economic stability, and, as we'll discuss here, climate policy. In this video, we're going to discuss that whilst Biden and Trump both promised to achieve very similar outcomes for the American people, their approach to climate change could not be more different. Joe Biden and Donald Trump are campaigning for one of the most important political roles in the world, and unsurprisingly have conflicting views on many critical issues. Climate change is a clear example. This can easily be seen in the disparate language used by both candidates.
What do you think the world should be doing about climate change, and do you still harbor that skepticism?
I feel that the United States has tremendous wealth.
I know the climate change is a challenge that's going to define our American future. I know meeting the challenge will be a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to jolt new life into our economy.
And I'm not going to lose that wealth. I'm not going to lose it on dreams, on windmills, which, frankly, aren't working too well.
We also know that transforming the American electrical sector to produce power without producing carbon pollution and electrifying an increased share of our economy will be the greatest spurring of job creation and economic competitiveness in the 21st century.
It is clear from these videos, as well as their online media presence, that Biden and Trump have different opinions and priorities regarding environmental issues. But let's dig a bit deeper by analysing the past 4 years of the Trump administration. Compare this to the 8 years of the Obama administration, under which Biden acted as vice president, and then discuss Biden's Green New Deal. Let's take a look at how US energy generation changed under the Trump administration. Based on data from the US Energy Information Administration of energy production for each source as a percentage of the total, we can see that in 2016 to 2017, Trump began to replace Obama's clean energy plan. This began with an increase in coal generation, a fuel source with almost twice the greenhouse gas emissions compared to natural gas, around 20 times the emissions of renewables, and 70 times the amount of nuclear. From 2017 onwards, there was a drop in coal generation, which has been mostly replaced by other prominent fossil fuel sources such as natural gas and crude oil. This came alongside a plethora of policy changes. For example, in 2018, the Trump administration rolled back Obama-era emissions limits on greenhouse gas emissions for newly built coal power plants. Renewables and nuclear power also showed a reduction from 2017 to 2019. These trends show that the Trump administration has prioritised economic prosperity over the reduction of greenhouse gas emissions. This crossed an important threshold in 2019 when, for the first time since 1957, US energy production exceeded consumption, allowing for the sale and export of the surplus, as well as decreasing the United States' dependency on other nations and drastically reducing their investment in the Middle East. The United States' withdrawal from the Paris Climate Agreement marked a key moment in both the Trump administration's climate and foreign policies, demonstrating that they were willing to punctuate their anti-globalist America First rhetoric with action.
The United States will withdraw from the Paris Climate Accord.
The Trump administration received $2 million from fossil fuel companies during their campaign, and once elected, Trump's inaugural committee received $107 million. This strong government lobbying may have influenced Trump's decision in leaving the Paris Agreement. This was set in motion in 2017, with the official withdrawal being effective on the 4th of November 2020, the day after the presidential election. However, Trump's publicity stated reasons for leaving this treaty lie fundamentally in the sanctions placed on the US. Trump had stated these to be: the Paris Climate Accord is simply the latest example of Washington entering into an agreement that disadvantages the United States at the exclusive benefit of other countries. This is an argument made regularly by individual developed nations, suggesting the burden should be made by others. But climate change is a global issue that can only be solved by countries working together. China, which Trump regularly mentions when talking about climate change, is currently the highest CO2 emitter globally, with twice the emissions of the US. But when you scale this as CO2 emissions per capita, the US is twice as high as China, with the US still holding the title for highest cumulative historical CO2 emissions. So whilst China's CO2 emissions are a major concern, they are no scapegoat for the history of the US, a country whose current wealth has stemmed massively from the use of fossil fuels. This economic wealth allows developed countries like the US to have the ability to develop technologies which can counteract anthropogenic climate change. We've seen how the Trump administration has dealt with energy generation in relation to climate change. We can compare this directly to the Obama administration, of which Joe Biden was the vice president. We can see that drastic reductions were made in coal generation, but were mostly replaced with natural gas and crude oil, with an increase in renewables from around 10 to 12%. Whilst not necessarily extremely progressive, this shows a focus on reducing carbon emissions, something which during the Trump administration has plateaued. This graph shows the United States CO2 emissions in comparison to the international targets set by the Paris Climate Accord. These targets still seem salvageable with the transition to low-carbon energy generation. Considering the portfolio of major donors to Trump's 2020 campaign, if Trump is provided with a canvas of a second term, we can expect to see the continuation of drastic measures being taken in favour of the fossil fuel industry and corporate giants. With less than 3 weeks until Election Day, the incumbent administration has provided little to no indication as to what key policy goals they seek to address, leaving the world in the uncomfortable position of guessing their agenda based on the groundwork of their first term. There has been seemingly more emphasis placed on condemning Biden's policies, such as opposing his climate plan, for being far left or even being in left-wing la-la land. This is of course relative to the political right-wing landscape of US politics. Now let's take a look at Biden's climate plan. Biden's climate plan promises to make a federal investment of $1.7 trillion over the next 10 years, as well as leveraging additional private, state and local investments of more than $5 trillion during this time to reform the US energy landscape, which will be partly paid by eliminating Trump's corporate tax cuts. This money will be invested into both nuclear and renewable power generation, whilst also developing the grid-scale energy storage infrastructure necessary for the long-term viability of renewable energy. The money will also be invested in the construction of zero-carbon buildings, promising, much like Trump in 2016, a massive increase in blue-collar jobs. Biden has also suggested he would push climate change up the geopolitical agenda, with a quote from Jake Sullivan, Biden's national security advisor, when he was vice president, and now member of the candidate's inner circle. He has said right out of the gate, "We're not just rejoining Paris, we are going to rally the nations of the world to get everyone to up their game, to elevate their ambition to do more." As with any political campaign, it is hard to say how much of the proposed climate plan will come to fruition, but there are some notable and concrete plans which are supported by key Democrats with a history of climate change policy. Bernie Sanders, who after ending his election campaign has vouched support for Biden. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, sponsor of the Green New Deal, was nominated to co-chair Biden's climate task force, and Kamala Harris, who has a history of supporting environmental protection, has been nominated as Biden's running mate to become the vice president if Biden is elected. The Biden campaign has also received endorsement from the Scientific American, the first endorsement in their 175-year history. Both candidates sit at the opposite side of the spectrum regarding climate change, but aim to offer similar social results, such as an increase in labour jobs, where Trump will continue to offer jobs for the fossil fuel industry, whereas Biden will support a transition to jobs in the renewable industry, which already has 10 times as many jobs in the US, according to researchers at University College London. We will find out on November the 3rd whose vision of America's future will begin to come to life based on who can swing the majority of the electorate. As well as the presidency, the control of both the House of Representatives and the Senate will play huge roles, as we have currently seen the bottlenecking of some policies due to the Republicans holding the Senate and the Democrats holding the House of Representatives. If either party controls both, they will have much more freedom to implement policies. There are many facets to this election, and this has only been a very light overview of the complicated 2020 election campaign with respect to climate change. Please take a look in the description to find many useful resources. Look after yourselves, each other, and most importantly, become as informed as possible and vote responsibly. And share this video if you found it interesting. Thanks again, R. Eden.